Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of School for Advanced Research, speaking to you from my office at SAR. It's my pleasure to thank you for joining us for the second event in our series, Senses of Place. Across the 4 events, the series explores the cultural significance of place and shares new insights into the relationship between cultures and the structures created by their unique environments. We're grateful to the Ethel Jane Westfeld Bunting Foundation for sponsoring the Senses of Place series. The series coincides with the 25th anniversary of the publication of a seminal SAR Press publication, Senses of Place, edited by Stephen Feld and the late Keith Basso. Earlier this month, we hosted a book talk honoring this anniversary, and you can find the recording for the event on our YouTube channel. On July 30th, we're hosting the next event in the series, Chaco, Crafted Space, Remembered Place, serving as SAR's annual Cordell Lecture. This event welcomes archaeologists Steve Lexon, Ruth Van Dyke, and Catherine Cameron, as well as an Indigenous scholar, Philip Tuwela-Stiwa. Thank you. The series concludes on July 8th with a panel discussion showing our strength, resilience, and compassion in the Indigenous Southwest, presented in partnership with Thornburg Investments and with additional support from the Ethel Jane Westfeld Bunting Foundation, Newman's Own Foundation, and Patricia Foshi. Links for these events, as well as our upcoming Mellon Foundation Latinx Studies Lecture featuring Arlene Davila on June 23rd, can be found in the chat window on your screen. Finally, we're hosting a member conversation with today's speakers at 4 p.m. Mountain Time today. There's still room to join that if you're a member. So please email Amy Schiffer, our membership coordinator, whose information will be also available in the chat window. She'll share a link with you. That conversation is open to current members, as I said. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank our SAR members for supporting our programs. If you're not yet a member, we encourage you to join. You can find information on that in the chat window now. Now for today's program, I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Dillehay, who will introduce his co-presenters, Christine Hasdorf and Carla Hernandez Garavito. Tom Dillehay, a senior scholar at SAR, is the Rebecca Webb Wilson University Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Religion, and Culture at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. He has strong professional connections to universities in Chile and Peru, and is the author of many books and articles, most on the archaeology of South America. Tom, I'm doing the handoff to you.
Thank you, Michael. And I welcome everybody participating in this webinar, all of the members of SAR and the general public. And I presume that within the general public audience that we have some of our colleagues and scholars, and also individuals who are professionals and other persons who are simply interested in this theme. So what I'm going to try and do in the introductory portion of this talk, and also my brief presentation, is to keep the technical language to a minimum, and I've asked my colleagues to do the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump immediately to the PowerPoint presentation, and then I will introduce my colleagues. Professor Christine Hasdorf is a professor at the University of California in Berkeley. She's director of the Archaeological Center or Institute there as well. She's worked a lot in the Andes, but other areas of the world as well, Italy, Mexico, Turkey. And she focuses on the complex societies. And for us, complex societies is pretty much anything above, let's say, an advanced hunter-gatherer life way up to empires, Roman, Aztec, Inca, so forth. She studies political changes, social life way changes related primarily to foodways. And she's really interested in, how all of these aspects of the past can be brought to life and a better understanding through plant use, but she's much more diverse than that and is one of the most amazing scholars examining the plant record in the past and how it relates to demography, social, political, economic changes, diet, nutrition, and so forth. And it's a pleasure to work with her. She also is a member of a project team that I'm running on the north coast of Peru, and I'm very grateful for her participation through the years. Carla Hernandez is a Peruvian archaeologist, anthropologist, who's worked throughout several areas of the Central Andes and at present in the Central Highlands of Peru. And she focuses on community transformations through time, but mainly within the Inca and the Spanish period. And both of these individuals as scholars focus on gender issues as it relates to materialism, cultural materialism, and other aspects as well. Very briefly about myself, I've worked across the US, Eastern US, Midwest, Southwest, Great Plains when I was in my younger stage of the career. But in recent years, done some work in India, Eastern Island, England, Mexico too, but mainly Peru and Chile. So the title of our talk is Places, Aesthetics and Meaning of Special Settings in the Andean Past and Present. And if you read the introduction to this talk, I placed a paragraph there that says, it separates the two concepts of space and place, but they're related terms, with space eventually becoming a place. And I know that there's probably multiple disciplines, anthropology, archaeology, sociology, geography, and so forth. Everybody's got a different definition of all of these terms. So I just simply tried to find one that kind of speaks to a wide mosaic of different meanings, symbolically, psychologically, and so forth. And as you will see, religiously, politically, socially, economically, and so forth. But the main issue is society, culture, and people interacting with the environment and identifying and giving meaning to that environment and special places in it through time and through space. Places such as Times Square, New York City, geysers in Yellowstone Park, National Park, Machu Picchu. But what's the process actually getting involved in all of this? There's a very famous social thinker, Frenchman, Honorary Lefebvre, talked about human perception of space out there and how we go about constructing space and places in our experience within it. And through time, by interacting with space and converting it over to identified places and embodying it and empowering it with identity, we give it names and we begin to relate to it, and it belongs to us and we belong to it. And I know this is very different for different individuals as well. The individual level, maybe a couple people, small group, community, even the world level, nation state, community, so forth. So as we interact with a lot of spaces and places, we empower them, we give them names, and we give them identity. And it becomes a process, as you'll see in our 3 talks, of place and identity making. Let me give you an idea. Back in the 70s, I was doing an archaeological project with a good colleague of mine, a Chilean colleague named Lautaro Nunez. We spent some time following caravan herds across this vast desert, the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, the world's driest desert and one of the highest in the world. When I first encountered that landscape, I knew nothing of the place names. We were walking with Aymara people and their caravans. And over a period of days and weeks, I began to learn the different place names that they knew about in their own language and had been identified for centuries, if not thousands of years. But individually speaking, I came to belong to the place through my visual contact with, for instance, on the left, the upper left, the Toconce volcano in the background, and these canyon lands in the lower right that you see. And I began to take on and empower myself within that landscape by becoming by identifying with it. But all of this was already done beforehand by the indigenous peoples there. And it was a long process through time and through space of taking that unknown, previously unknown, empty landscape and assigning value and assigning meaning to it. It could be economic value. It's finding turquoise mines or gold and silver mines. Could be sacred values assigned and meaning to it, such as this sacred volcano you see in the background. Or it could be land routes that people follow with their caravans and exchange, establishing, maintaining, and sustaining social relationships. It can be religious, where there are religious places and shrines that are set up all along here. So we go along through time, building this mosaic at different scales of the individual, up to the group, up to the community level, indigenous or non-indigenous, even to the country level itself, of empowering landscapes and also shifting spaces into place making and identity making as well. I think all of us can identify with that. Wherever you're living and wherever the audience is at present, out in the spaces around them, you know place names. You probably invent some names for certain places that don't have names because you've interacted with it, you've had experience with it. You perhaps perceive it differently. It could be a romantic spot that once a person had there with someone else. Or it could have been a special picnic or simply playing sports in a field that you did not know before. But this is an ongoing process and it's not locked in. And it's working at different scales, as you'll see in our talks. Here I present a couple of sites in Peru that operate on the global scale in terms of place and identity making. Machu Picchu, of course, on the left, and the famous Nazca Lines on the right. These are World Heritage sites that have been empowered by tourism and the economy of tourism on a global level. And there are many places like this around the world. And to me, that's one of the highest scales of empowering and place making and identity making. And not all of it is aesthetically pleasing. And not all of it is positive. I think in our own country here recently, we've had the experience of canceling, let's say, removing plaques and monuments that given to the Confederacy. So for some people, that will remain as a commemoration, a memory of their history. But for others, it will and has become a sad, tragic moment in their life history. Individuals who were involved in slavery and their predecessors as well. So all of these monuments are not always, as the title sort of implies, perhaps aesthetically pleasing and has meaning and value to us, because there are a few negative aspects to it too, which I don't want to dwell on. So let me sort of move on at this point and get into my area of specialty. I'm going to take you to two places. One is in South Central Chile, where I've been working with the Mapuche people, ethnography and archaeology for roughly 45 years or so. And then I'll go to the north coast of Peru and in the highlands of Peru and pass the talk to my colleague, Carla Hernandez. The Mapuche people, there's about 900,000 of them still survive in South Central Chile and a few thousand more over in Argentina. And of the hundreds, if not a few thousand ethnic groups encountered by the Spanish Empire, all the way from Florida across to the American Southwest and California, this was the only group that strongly resisted Spanish influence and occupation for about 285 continuous years. They were never occupied. There were military incursions into their territory and they fiercely defended. And in fact, it's the only ethnic group in all of the Americas where the Spanish crown in 1641 established a formal frontier with the Mapuche people, or Araucanians as some people call them. Well, one of the issues that unified their resistance across space was the building of mounds, as you see here on the left and on the right, that began back in the 1200 AD, but really took hold with mound building as sacred places of military, religious, social resistance, all the way up to about, let's say, 1893, These mounds are still in operation, and they are still used as very special religious political places in the Mapuche world. The one on the left that you see is called Rewicuel, which means altar on top of a mound. And there's a procession of getting up to this sacred plaza. And today they still engage in rituals there at this mound, which dates back about 800 or 900 years ago. And on the right is the most sacred of all of them, called Trincuel, the Grandfather Mound, so to speak. And you can see all the trails going over it. So as people leave one indigenous community called Lof in Mapuche, they cross over this mound. They're obligated to, and it's right on the border between three different communities. And it's a sacred procession as you socially move from one community to the other. But at one point in time, before about 1200 AD or so, these were empty spaces that did not have the religious value, the religious meaning, and the political connotation that they had probably beginning around the mid 1500s, 1600s, up to even today. Although there's no warfare with the Spanish, there's still conflict with the government of Chile. So what's happening here, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, these mounds in Mapuche language have Mapuche names. They're considered to be living mounds. They are relatives. People talk to them. The shamans speak with them. It's kind of a personification of the landscape, attribution of a personal nature or human characteristic to something non-human, in this case, the mounds, which people do see as being human. It's kind of a representation of abstract quality in a human form. So you can do this with persons and animals or objects. And one of the things in the Andes, as in many areas of the world, are these animated landscapes. When I'm out working with the shamans, and here's one on the upper left called Machu, she cautiously walks out in the forest and asking me not to step on this plant or that plant, or down a certain pathway, or to touch a certain stone, because they're animated and they have spirits. Their world is very different from ours. They assign and empower places on an equal scale with humans. And not to speak too roughly about it, but the Western world sort of sees itself, humans, as the dominant species. And those resources and places and spaces out there are largely, unfortunately, with a fair number of people and countries to be exploited. And nature's not always seen on equal terms with humans as they are with indigenous populations. I'm just giving you sort of a view here of Mapuche territory. This is a sacred rewi next to the shaman, the Machi. She climbs up this to speak to the deities and the ancestors. And also on the right, there's another sacred mound in the background, and this is a sacred ceremonial field called Niyatun, where she carries out her ceremonies with a larger public. This cultural lifeway is beginning to disappear. There's a few places that people still live in these thatched huts that you see here, but they are coming under increasing control and acculturation by the modern world, obviously, as many groups in the world are today. But the shamans in particular still sort of retain this indigenous traditional lifeway of seeing nature and culture on equal par and animating the world out there in religious ways. So the Mapuches, they struggle within the Chilean nation today, and Argentina as well. They're seeking self-determination and autonomy. And it's really about places. And when they are in a dialogue with the government, they're talking about their territory. They're talking about and framing it within their ancient territories itself and how they want sovereignty for these places. And these are sacred places, they're economic, historic, social places, the communities where they live as well. And they are acutely aware of the fact that that was empty space out there before Europeans came onto the scene. And they empowered all of these by identifying them, interacting with these spaces, and acculturating them into Mapuche places, historically, demographically, socially, and so forth. So let me begin the end on here on a note that in recent years, I've been working on a very early ritual mortuary mound on the north coast of Peru. It's a massive mound, 180 meters long, 32 meters high, called the Dark Mound. As you can see, it's right on the ocean on the north coast of Peru. It was a specialized mound, special place that these people built at this time, unlike anything else in this area of Peru. And the interesting thing is that today, taking the past into the present, shamans, or curanderos as they're called on the North Coast, still go to this mound. And you can see on the right-hand side down here, these little packets and bundles. They bundle up offerings and place them within the mound and on top, mainly coca leaves and the feathers of pelicans, which have a special symbolic meaning that I will not get into, but it's special to them. So I will end on this note. I did my dissertation in this area you see here in the central highlands of Peru. To me, it has special meaning. I still go up there every 3 years, and I lived there for a year. And on the right-hand side, I went up and down this hill slope studying an economic model called verticality in the Andes, where you spread people out up and down the mountain slopes. From the top where they're growing potatoes and animal husbandry with animals, down the bottom where there's cotton and fruit, and they exchange it up and down this vertical slope. That has very special meaning to me, but to the people in Chacta who live there, it has a different meaning. To me, it has academic meaning and value. To them, it's sacred, it's economic, it's historical, it's social, because it connects them. And they have multiple names for all the routes up and down in certain visual places. As we look out onto space, we ought to say, look at that mountain or look at that hillside. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It's interesting. And we might give it a name, or we might go back to it. We feel like we belong to it. It belongs to us. But there are others before us, and there will be others after us who are involved in this ongoing process of identity making and place making as well, adding to that place and to that landscape. So I will stop there, and I will pass the word to my colleague, Carla Hernandez. Thank you, everybody.
Right. Thank you, Tom. Let me share my screen so I can follow. There we go. Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Tom, for inviting me to join you and Christine in this conversation today. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you here at SAR. And as Tom mentioned, I'm going to talk about a part of the Peruvian Andes. It's called Huarochirí. It is close to where Tom just left us in the narrative about Chacaya. And I'm going to follow on these topics of creating an identity, creating community ties, and try to expand it a little bit into discussing how through place we are also creating history. So let me show you a little bit of where I work. This is the region of Huarochirí. It's in the central part of Peru. It goes into the middle and upper courses of the valleys that we usually recognize at the central coast. From an archaeological perspective, this is an area from where we do not know a whole lot. What we do know is that we have a bunch of different sites that are preferably located in hilltops, but we don't find any evidence of any political unification or an entity that we could talk about, like we do, for example, about the Inca or the Chimu or the Moche. We see a lot of dispersed settlements that are preferably located on hilltop sites. And that traditionally for archaeology is read as some form of maybe defense mechanism. But through what research has taken place in Huarochirí so far, we know that the actual goal of having these sites in hilltops was to maintain visual connections between the specific settlements and the mountains that were surrounding them. We talk about a sacralized landscape. We talk about something that actually has a lot of meaning in bringing all these different communities together as creating something new, something that people can identify themselves with, some form of unity. In this area of Huarochirí, we can ask many of these questions Tom has been raising about how do we construct place out of space? How do we give it meaning? How do we make it something in which we can look at agents that maybe are not human and create a specific and very powerful types of relationships? So the way I'm going to talk about Huarochirí today is going to be first focusing more on the historical aspect. Then I'm going to show you a little bit of the archaeological research I have been doing there and kind of end up talking about what these mountains mean today. So the big thing with Huarochirí is that it's a place we know very well in the literature, particularly the historical literature, because there's a unique document that was compiled, created here in Huarochirí, that it's called the Huarochirí manuscript. I'm not going to go into all the details of the creation of the manuscript, but in a very short summary, this was compiled by 1608. And what it's really unique is that it's a history, a very local history about myths, about rituals, and about everything that was before the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. What is remarkable is that the way it was compiled, it was almost an ethnography. It was a mestizo priest that requested indigenous assistance to help him in compiling these histories in the eve of what we call in the Andes the extirpation of idolatries. This idea that indigenous people were not truly converted and came and continued to practice rituals in their original places just under the guise of Catholicism. This is the only document we have in Peru that is actually written in Quechua. And it is remarkable in the sense that it is very much a spatial-based history. It's a history of locations and places that are not necessarily just meaningful, but are beings, that they exist. And it is in these places that the community comes together. And I look at this as a history-making exercise, this looking at place, precisely because that is how it is phrased in the introduction of the manuscript. This is the translation in English of the text you see here above. And it is, you can see like even on the onset of this text, that it's supposed to be about all these places, this list of shrines, basically in the Spanish view of rituals. You see what the scribe is telling us here. If the ancestor of the people called Indians had no writing in earlier times, then the lives they lived would not have faded from view until now. This is the goal, to create a history. And that history, again, it is completely embedded in place. Now, the protagonist, the place that is so meaningful, that gives sense to all this community in Guarachurí, is this snow-capped mountain you see here, named Pariacaca. History becomes assembled through the actions of Pariacaca across the landscape. Pariacaca is both being as place. This is what we call usually in Andean archaeology a sahuaca, a sacred place that also exists, that is an ancestor and really creates a very complicated community between people and land. The history of how the people of Guarachurí came to be is the history of Pariacaca's birth, of his conquest, of the takeover of the region that was populated by other people before. And one of the central aspects in which these people of Guarachurí that live in dispersed settlements in the hilltops come together is by continually performing rituals in honor of Pariacaca. So in that sense, Pariacaca is named, and it also is ever present in the enactment of these rituals, in these performances. And as such, Pariacaca is truly sort of like this embodied history of the community that otherwise wouldn't be there. Now, in order to kind of expand these ideas of Pariacaca and connect it to archaeological work, I've been thinking of a framework that encompasses a couple of specific books. One of them is, I'm not going to have to discuss in great detail in the present company, because you all know exactly what this is about, Senses of Place. And one of the concepts that comes through in Senses of Place that I think it's very critical to understanding this idea of place as a history is the idea of gathering. This comes from Edward Casey's article. One of the things he talks about is that places as beings do not only materialize history, but they gather those meanings, they gather those values. And in gather them, we don't think just of the accumulation, we think of them holding them, of people being able to access history through this interaction. And in that sense, place and community become mutually constitutive. This is what they call interanimation. On thinking of how to apply this to a specific Andean framework, I've been looking at Marisol de la Cadena's publication, Earth Beings, because this definition of Earth Beings is very close to the way I'm thinking about Pariacaca and how archaeologists in general thinks about huacas. But one of the things that is really rich of this definition is that in thinking of how places exist, and Tom was mentioning before the idea of naming and how naming creates such important meanings, it expanded to include also the act of storytelling. We could be talking about myths that seem to be atemporal, so that seem to exist outside of what we in the Western world consider as traditional history. But that said, in this storytelling, places come into existence, community come into existence. This is Marisol de la Cadena looks at it from the perspective of Cusco, and she talks about a Quechua word, huilacuy, which is defined as the act of telling or narrating an event that happened. And that event may sometimes leave topographic traces like lagoons or mountains or rock formations. But that evidence is not just a materialization of the history. That place can be replicated, re-experienced, re-embodied through the act of telling its histories. So the earth beings are more than just a sacred place. They are kin as well. They exist in the same moment in which we are talking about them. So looking at these perspectives, I was trying to think of Pariacaca as an earth being that is history, that is re-experienced by people when they replicate these rituals. And in being this embodied history, we also see how it has endured, how it has gone through successive experiences of colonialism by the Inca Empire in the 15th century, by the Spanish Empire into the 16th century, by now nation states that look at them as abandoned archaeological places in some cases, or a matter of heritage in others. So how do we look at this endurance, looking at these meanings and this exercise of history making? So just to note, we have known of the importance of Pariacaca for a long time from I jump ahead from historical documents. This is a map that was attached to a 1586 document known as the Descripción de la Provincia de Yauyos, one of the writings that are part of the Andean section volumes of the Relaciones Geográficas de Indias. We see this map as an idealized version of the landscape created by the Spanish. We're talking about what the Spanish authorities wanted to see, right? Like a landscape made by cities, by urbanization, by a strict control over how people move across the landscape. And even in the top of this map, you see still that Pariacaca holds this position as watching over his children, as being central to the construction of identity. From an archaeological perspective, we see the importance of this in that we consistently find that most of the sites are always surrounding rock outcrops of different kind. And different scholars, different colleagues of mine and myself, we have looked at them at these rock outcrops in different ways through time. Sometimes we've looked at them as lithified aspects of the myth of Pariacaca, sometimes of avatars. But in thinking about them today, I am almost thinking of them as being Pariacaca's body himself whenever these performances, these interactions with people come into being. I have been looking at this idea through my excavations in this site. It's called Canchaje. And one of the things that called me to excavate on this site was that I was very interested on how local history expanded to incorporate the history of the Inca conquest. This site was very unique, in which we had this rock outcrop that was speaking directly to this local logic of rock outcrops attached to Pariacaca, creating this memory of being a broader community. And there's these very large plazas that you see here that are traditional of the Inca presence in the Andes. When we excavated in the outcrop, we find the traditional evidences that show that it was a ritual site. We find evidence of assemblages. We found some lithic points that were associated to specific rituals described in the manuscript. We found sort of like different steps leading to the top that follow this procession aspect Tom was discussing with the Mapuche. And we also found evidence of looted tombs, so suggesting that this was a sacred place to which bodies were returned. When looking at the plazas, though, beyond the aspect of traditional Inca commensal polities, this idea of big feast in which the Inca established relationships with local elites, we also found a very strange feature, which is this wall you see here in the middle. And this wall was built in a very unique way. You can see a detail of that below. It was sectioned by 6 stone pillars. 4 of them were connected in here, and 2 of them were freestanding here. And for some reason, they were built in these sections and then fill out with the stones as you see in the middle. And this got our eye because this is not how people in Huarochirí build things, and it's not how the Inca builds things either. When we excavated in the plaza, we found that we had succession of plazas that were basically empty, well cleaned, but some of the ceramic fragments we found seem to be earlier than the dates we had for this section of the site. We knew this was the Inca part of the site. And in trying to understand the function of this wall, why to go through the really unnecessary labor of doing this sectioning, we found, looking at the manuscript, that this was actually a specific feature that was used in the beginning of Paracaca's festivities. As you can see in the description there, this wall was basically a point, it was used for observations. A ritual specialist would look at different sky, like different movements of the sky through the filters of these walls and kind of decide when the festival of Paracaca would start. And in looking at it that way and thinking of place, rather than thinking of the Inca encapsulating this ritual aspect of Paracaca's myth, we were thinking of how history can actually expand to incorporate the Inca. The Inca are never presented as a conqueror. They're never presented as an enemy. It's always an Inca that is in the Huarochirí manuscript subjugated to Paracaca's rituals. He's a dancer. He asks for advice. He asks for help. And thinking about place and these logics of both the natural landscape that it's talking about, this myth of Paracaca, and these built features that are so dependent on that relationship, we can think of a history that expands, because the place is the being, the place is Paracaca, and Paracaca is history. It could come to incorporate the Inca. So to close this off, I just wanted to go back to this idea of the earth beings that are so powerful and constitutive of communities' identities. And in Huarochirí, we have way more of these mountains that we would consider huacas or earth beings, depending on how we look at them, that are experienced by community members today in very different ways. One of my favorite ones is this one called Cinco Cerros, and it appears in the manuscript first as an antagonist of Paracaca, not necessarily as a place that is an ally, but a place the community was taken away so the lands could be given to the children of Paracaca. And in the top of the different peaks you see here, the central feature are these funerary structures. And thinking of how we look at them differently, though, from all the different views of the people that interact with this mountain, kind of how Tom was talking about Chillon. We can look at them from a very archaeological perspective. If we look at them, there are places of burial. There are places probably to create ideas of ancestrality. We can look in through those little windows in the funerary structure and see disassembled bodies. We can look at them as we look at in the manuscript, like a place that was originally an enemy that was defeated by the deity, by this earth being that really created the identity of the people of Huarochirí. And today we can look at a place that is still part of the everyday experience of many of the community members there. If we look within this window, we will find coca leaves, we will find bottles of aguardiente, we will find flowers, we will find cigarettes, we will find evidence that people still interact with these places and these bodies and see this kinship, see this relationship. So when we look at these sites as history, it is a history that is ongoing. It is a history that it's not just past, but it's constructed by this relational aspect of how people and place come together as one to create different forms of identity. And with that, I'm just going to thank everyone again for listening to this brief description of my research and pass it on to Christine.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Please tell me if you can't. I'm so pleased to be here and hear all these wonderful stories today already. So I'll be talking about the research that I've been involved in since 1992 on the Lake Titicaca Basin, which you see here in this slide, focusing primarily on evidence for longevity and sustainability within this very dry, high steppe landscape. The Taraco Peninsula is a jut of land that extends into the shallow southern lake of the large lake basin. And its shoreline is 3,800 meters, so it's quite high up in the Andes. And it's unique because it's a very, very high lake and quite dry with radical seasons. I'm giving you a lot of pictures just to get a sense of what it's like. It provides diverse resources, however, it being tempered by being in the lake. It has the lake shore, the lake, valleys, hillsides, and a large pampa along the lake shore. And it's been home to occupation, settled occupation that represents 4,000 years, where we have evidence from our archaeological work of fishing, herding, farming, collecting that allowed people to continue living in this, what looks like very stark environment. But this is the region where potato and quinoa were domesticated and where the llama and alpaca were as well, this greater basin. And so it becomes one of those core domestication areas of the world. So the Turaco Archaeological Project that I've had the honor to oversee has completed archaeological, ecological, and ethnographic work on the peninsula. You can see here circled in red. The region is temporal phasing, and again, not too much on this, I just want to get you oriented. Because I focus on this whole time period, we start with the early formative. These were the first settled communities that we find on the peninsula around 1500 BCE through the formative period, and then finalizing with the Tiwanaku sort of sphere of influence that sort of incorporates everybody within the basin and of course beyond. And we see increasing productivity throughout that time. The itself, this is a vista of it from the hillside, looking down to it and the lake. It's all around you, even though you only see the mound there. And there we've done archaeological excavations that and studying of food production that includes plant, animal, molecular, and soil analyses. And we've studied the broader landscape as well. Now, to orient ourselves, we've increasingly been focusing on this indigenous worldview colleagues have discussed already, which is great, especially the Marisol de la Cadena's work of Earth Things, and I'm going to be using that term, so Carla's introduced that for you already. But I like this particular image of the indigenous landscape worldview because it shows one aspect that's, I think, very important, and that's sort of the cycling, that circling of moisture. Now, the current's residents' ancestors have been through a great deal since the Tiwanaku dissolution, which I didn't include on the timeline, with the Inca conquest, the Spanish conquest, and then the equally repressive Republican era, filled with haciendas across the landscape, which were only dissolved in 1950. Those whose long-lived structures continue today with racism in this region still. But throughout that, our evidence suggests that communities and people and lineages and families continued in this region through their intimate, constant engagement with their landscape, making it productive for them and for every other being that lives there. This was completed in part by engaging with the beings and the energies and getting to know the landscape, of course, very, very well. But it's pretty clear that you can see in this illustration that there's a series of beings, both the bodies of water, the movement of water, the rocks, the plants, the mountains, and the meteorological elements that all had an influence. They're not passive backdrops or abstract spirits. They're tangible beings that people influence through recognition, watching, and feeding. And these beings and places in the landscape in turn influence the residents. These are the interrelationships that we see today through forging of care and gifting. And Carla talked about all the gifts that she's seen at the sites that she's been working at. And this is my humble kind of version of what we found from our ethnographic work through local indigenous worldview. And again, the names are in Aymara, but I just wanted to share this with you about this sense of recycling, both around the home, but also throughout the greater landscape. And that this sort of mutual influencing and caring relationships are portrayed here with the arrows moving around. Gifting of food can come in many forms: a statement, a song, an offering, a thought, smoke, a fire, liquid, or food. These offerings nurture and feed the beings, being fed and recognized by those who stop and engage with them. these beings feel nourished and tended and in turn give to the gifter. That's the concept that the residents talk about. Meanwhile, the person doing this takes the time to look at the local landscape, to get to know it, to watch for the signs. This is how Native people hunt animals, collect plants, net fish, and grow crops. Indigenous American societies have demonstrated this long-term sustainability using this sentient ontology. As Indigenous anthropologist David Walsh states, Indigenous ontologies are predicated on a relatable world wherein Indigenous peoples directly engage with the environment and living beings within the environment, thus avoiding the Cartesian dichotomy of nature culture prevalent in modern Western worldviews. And I think both Tom and Carla kind of alluded to this breaking down of that nature culture divide that we see so prevalently in the Andean engagement. This is a religion of this world, centering on the social relationships among people, plants, animals, water, and weather. All are engaged with watching, interacting, and hopefully caring for those around them in a mesh of give and take. This is a spiritscape where all beings must be nourished to survive. In these ideas, we can see the roots of our own Western ecology and sustainability, but without the Cartesian dichotomy. Something of value, at least for me, to consider, and hopefully you too.
Christine, I hate to interrupt you, but we're getting a lot of feedback from your papers or your desktop. So I just wanted, I had a couple of comments, so I just wanted to make sure that you knew.
Can I talk about them at the end? I mean, is it that my presentation isn't coming through, or is it questions about my talk?
Oh no, there's just some static from the papers on your desk or whatever you're referring to. So we're having some trouble hearing you talk.
Oh goodness, okay, all right, I will move that paper away then. Okay, I'll do that, sorry, thank you. Okay, I wanted to present this Inca stone, the Inca Sawete stone. Some of you may have maybe visited it or at least seen pictures of it, but it clearly illustrates this point I think we're all trying to make about this pre-colonial animated landscape cosmology. It is filled with cat guardians, water beings, flowing water, and terrace fields, materializing this blending of food production and guardians and the propagation of plants and the place of these things. Such a linking argument helps us tack between the present and the past. So with that, I want to turn back farther yet, back to our formative times at Chiripa proper, from the research that the project I've been involved in has been working on, and talk about sort of the meaning of place that we've seen there. This is the core of the settlement as far as we can find from the excavations we've been able to complete. And you can see that it's made up of a series of small enclosures encircling the large stepped platform mound that's been so renowned from previous archaeological work. There seemed to be space for a range of group sizes. Here, a big space between the main mound and the spring that I've given you a picture of here, which allows for many, many people to come together. Probably many communities could come throughout from the region, both the islands and the landscape. So up to a couple hundred people, if not more. So everybody could gather in this area around the spring, and this was probably a very special gathering place. And the second interior of the second place is the interior of this mound. That it's not a sunken court, but it's enclosed by the walls of the stepped platform mound, and there would have held less people, about 100 people. This has been recently reconstructed by the Bolivian government, but as you can see here, people still continue to use it. There's fire remains over in the lower right part, and then offering of a bottle there. You can see it's still used for renewal ceremonies. And the many sunken courts around there would have been like this. You've seen the nighttime sky and would have focused on the star and the Milky Way and all that's linked to in terms of the water movement across throughout the environment, linking to the lake. And the third place I want to mention, place of ritual, is the most restricted inside small rooms on top of the mound, probably for only 5 or 6 people. And these are in green there in the map. And I think these were special sacred storage rooms, places where individual lineages or families would have been gone for a ceremony. And they're much like what we see in Frank Solomon's recent book. The title is there on the screen, 2018 book, where he describes an annual ceremony, a nighttime ceremony, where people go together in a small room to offer prayers throughout the night to the mountain for protection of their animals and their harvests. Such built places were clearly important ritual spaces for these residents, bringing together, concentrating the living landscape and its potency in one place, where the inhabitants would give to and talk to the beings in a concentrated, focused, centripetal locale, sort of bringing the whole landscape together. So not only were they engaged with the whole landscape, but they also materialized by building these architectural features. So I want to quickly turn to the ethnography that we've been able to complete over the last few years, 2017 and 18. Recently doing this, requested by the community to do so, to record the residents' landscape engagements for the generations to come, making movies, but also recording and transcribing all of their interviews. And we're still working on the interviews because we completed 89 interviews with local residents, focusing on their ontological concepts and agricultural production. These open-ended interviews revolved around maintaining the landscape and all that dwell in it. We found reciprocal relationships between people and the land relating to protection, forged through rituals that are aimed at assuring successful agricultural productivity and resilience, as well as for the beings that reside there. One aspect that really jumped out at us was the importance of water, especially the springs. All have names, puhus as they're called in Aymara, both in the valleys and also in the landscape puna, as you see on the right. Many farming tasks are completed at these openings of the earth, watering animals, but also cleaning, fermenting, and leaching crops, which also is occurring there on the right. These are locations of power to the residents of the community that beings inhabit and must be recognized and cared for. In fact, at one spring, the Pilani, we were there with Facundo Yusko, Hillside Spring, and there we learned about how there are wildcat guardians that dwell there and protect these springs. Now, I have a picture of the actual local wildcats, but Facundo claimed that there were these guardian wildcats that you don't have to really see them, but you know they're there, and you know they're there because the springs continue to thrive. And so therefore the people also want to protect the springs to thrive for the guardian, and then the guardian in turn protects the spring. And these are messengers, these animals are messengers between the landscape and the spiritscape as well, helping them communicate about future weather and harvests to come, the next planting season. So it's a lovely kind of cycling of beings and spirits and the land. And this is best represented in the other ethnographic point I want to bring up an example called the Chihithaki, or the hail pathways. And these pathways you see drawn here on this map protects the whole landscape of the community annually through a mapping right. And you can see the two paths, one in dark blue and one in light blue. And through these processions, two processions that begin and end at the taipei of the community, or the central place, today now right above the school and at the school, but was right above and at the mound as well. These two processions depart and end at this taipei, and they do this every February, performed by 6 designated community leaders, which is a pretty serious task. And over these 2 days, they circumvent, they circulate and walk throughout the hills and valleys, encircling all of the productive land and all the land that is theirs now, making offerings to the sky, clouds, and earth beings, stopping at 14 special places, or wakas, illustrating not only the importance of this land earth being relationship and the maintenance of that, the offering, the recognition, the watching, and the visiting, the giving recognition to them. So again, that brings me back to how these chthonic powers interact daily in the household, but also annually throughout the farming cycle there to guard and protect the spirits and the people who dwell there. And I want to conclude with the Chiripa archaeological evidence again, to kind of cycle back to see this same materialization in the archaeological past that I think we are seeing in these activities of the people today. We see here in this plaque, this materialization, I think, of the earth being life force. This is a stone carved plaque that was discovered on the Chiripa Mound in 1930, in the 1930s work. It's now in the Bolivian Museum in La Paz. But you can note the animating life forces portrayed in this stone carving by that, the jutting out growth arrows, basically, and circled by land and water beings, the sprouting force and promoting growth and renewal. So I see this as a form of the same engagement with earth beings. So as we tack back and forth in this long cultural trajectory, we encounter evidence of landscape and spiritscape management of a specific place that has allowed these farmers and herders to successfully work and live there through a series of conquests up until today. By acknowledging and respecting their resources, both visible and invisible, they continue to produce food for themselves and for the nearby city dwellers. It is small wonder that the elders of this community are keen to have these 1,000-year-old traditions recorded for their future children as the young migrate away from the countryside for education and jobs. And this world slips away with each elder's passing. It is an excellent example of custodial performance across the landscape in one of the rich hotspots of sustainable life and domestication on the planet. So with that, I want to thank you for attending this and listening, and I'm sorry about the noise. I've never listened to myself on the computer, but I also want to thank the indigenous community who of Chiripa especially, but all of them on the peninsula who have let me spend time with them and learn so much richness about their engagement with the landscape. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for those great presentations. As someone who's visited some of those places in the Andes, as well as on the eastern side, it just brought back memories of how people interact, finding offerings, as Carla mentioned, in all kinds of places, little bottles of liquor, cigarettes and coca leaves and that sort of thing. You realize that Andean religion, however invisible it may be to a short-term visitor, is still very much a part of people's experience. There's a question from Maryland that's addressed to Dr. Dillehay, but I guess it could go to all three of you. And this is a bit to one side of what you've been talking about, but it speaks to some of the same issues. Should NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Law, be modified to include important places, even if they may have no tangible evidence of a specific Native American affiliation? Or, and for that matter, even if they do have a specific affiliation, I don't understand them as being protected by NAGPRA as it's currently understood, written, and enforced. So where do you think we should go with that issue?
That's a difficult issue. And in Latin America, where I and my colleagues work, this specific point is not yet really at the level of discussion legally and topically as it is in the US. But I've been involved with certain issues like that on a local level in Peru, Chile, and Argentina. But back to the question here, I think that the first step would be to gather a tremendous amount of documentation and put it into some kind of digital format to assess all of these sites and their significance, whether tangible or intangible. Let's say a mound site or a fortress or whatever it might be, are an intangible place where local indigenous people, or even ethnohistorical records, say that this was a sacred place to, let's say, the Cherokee or somebody like that. I think that's the first step, but I think also education of non-indigenous peoples and others beyond us who are involved in this sort of thing need to learn the significance of this. I'm currently on a global commission to record sacred sites under threat by mining operations in Peru, Chile, and Argentina. And we are doing these two steps that I'm talking about now. And part of it is educating the miners themselves, the mining companies, most of which are from Canada, the US, and Europe, and Australia. So, and to answer the question, yes.
So something that's often that I've wondered about, and you might be in a position to speak to, is whether when societies start building man-made structures like the waka that you talked about, Tom, or the very complex terracing and irrigation systems that Christine was talking about in the Titicaca region, does that change? I mean, does that focus attention more on the anthropogenic structures, the human-made structures, than the natural surroundings, or does it actually intensify the interest in the natural surroundings like the wakas and rain and so on, precisely because the human-made system becomes even more dependent on them? Does that make sense?
It does. I'll pass that up to one of my colleagues who maybe would like to answer.
Well, I'll say something briefly. I mean, I have a feeling, I don't know if we're talking about the US or the Andes, but I have a feeling that while the indigenous people who live on the land are aware of their sacred locations, their power locations, their named locations, they have been really, since the Inca arrived, there's been, removal of their voice. And so there's been a lot of fairly recent engagement and backlash on that, but I don't know if there's actual real laws that are trying to make intangible locations more protected. I mean, I have a feeling that not even the tangible places are all that protected. I mean, increasingly so, definitely, like in the US. I mean, increasingly, so it all depends on the laws. I mean, we know that at least in the US, there's these laws, certain states, where if it's on private property, you can do whatever you want. The owner can destroy a site. Whereas in other countries, and like Peru, it becomes a state object. So once it's tangible and it's recognized and kind of named by the state, it's more protected. So the question is, what do you do with intangible? I mean, like, the Andenes, the terraces, the Inca terraces. I mean, I think those are increasingly being protected, right? But it's the, the intangible and the place of the landscape of these people. I mean, that's why the agrarian reform, why I mentioned the agrarian reform, that's super important, because that gave the land back, and in Peru too, a few years later, gave the land back to individual communities in a way that they have more capacity to protect that. But it's definitely not global, if you will.
Yeah, let me throw something in very quickly too, in working with the Mapuche, because this is a live issue now. It's very unlike, at least where I work in portions of the Andes, unlike the reservation lands here in the Southwest, where there's expansive territorial control, even reservations having their own police networks. But currently dealing with some legal issues with the Mapuche, whereby the government sees it as setting aside patches of resources for them. And their argument is you just can't do that, because there are intangible meanings and values assigned to hills, historic places that belong to lineages and ritual movements and famous battles with the Spanish and so forth, that fill in the space between two tangibles. And in the Western mentality, especially the legal mentality at the governmental level, simply does not understand this. I think this is one of the primary problems that indigenous peoples are having throughout the Amazon basin and all of the Andes and other portions of the world as well. We see it, not, those of us on the panel, but I think corporations and others see it as, look, you're interested in your resources, well, define those resources for me. That's impossible. Resources means something very different to indigenous peoples.
If I can.
I might just say, the book that Carla mentioned, the Marisol de la Cadena book, is absolutely on this very topic. So maybe Carla, rather than me talking, why don't you tell people about, because it's all about mining and saving a mountain and all of that.
So yeah, following up on what you were saying, like there is a recognition, I think, like, and I'm talking like probably from a Peruvian perspective, even though we may not get those meanings, we are aware they exist. And we do understand that it's not uncommon, like we are all like Western archaeologists, right? In a way, one way or the other. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that when I climb a site, I like start doing pagos and like make sure to please ask for permission and make sure, like we still have some idea of these relationships. Part of the intangible and tangible conversation, it's also like lack of imagination, right? Like, because we do have that codified up to a point in a law in Peru, we do talk about paisajes. We talk about those landscapes that are not just the archaeological site, but these places that are supposed to be also experienced. But that's very different than to actually know how to engage with them. And what Marisol de la Cadena does very beautifully is like, like showing how even for her, like language fails her sometimes in trying to communicate all these values that are trying to be expressed by the community leaders that are working with her. I will also just add to that it is also an issue of preservation of these sites, is precisely because everything turns into national patrimony. There are not enough resources to take care of the amount of sites that exist in South America. And you all that have worked in Peru know that like, we have a bunch of sites that are declared, but actually having funding to work on them and protect them, that's definitely a challenge. But it's slowly changing, I feel. I've seen a lot more of the civil community engaged in the preservation of archaeological sites, of special places, but the resources are not there yet.
You know, I have this conversation with CEOs of some of those mining companies in Chile and where I work in northern Peru. And they feel like they're occasionally being accused of discrimination. There's some discrimination, but I think the main problem is ignorance and just the lack of education. And I think part of that blame goes to what you were speaking about, Carla, lack of resources to protect these sites. And also, part of the blame goes on us archaeologists for not maybe making a bigger effort for public outreach and to educate the general public on these issues. So it's a complicated matter.
Well, in the United States, one of the ironies is that certain public lands where you think there might be a better opportunity to preserve the landscape and honor indigenous practices, there's some restrictions that relate to the constitutional prohibition of prioritizing one religion over another. So years ago, I was deep into the litigation about Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and a judge ruled so the native peoples who practice a sun dance looking at Devil's Tower complained that it was very difficult for them to, undertake this ritual with climbers in spandex, climbing up the side of the monument. And the judge, and yet it was not possible, it was not legal or consistent with constitutional practice to say that the native peoples, the Lakota and others, had priority over other non-indigenous people who wanted to use the site. So the final decision was kind of interesting. The judge said, while the National Park Service could not prohibit climbing on the site, they could request that climbers voluntarily suspend climbing during the Sundance period, which I believe was in June. And in fact, it was kind of as you say, Tom, it was sort of an educational experience for people. Instead of forcing them to do something, it's like the masking requirements. It seems to produce in some people a very hostile reaction that their rights are being abridged. When you ask them to do it and you explain why, it turned out that a very high percentage of people willingly stood down. The other interesting wrinkle was that a small group of opposing climbers argued that rock climbing was their religion and that should be equally honored. I don't think they got too far with that argument, but it just shows how in a multicultural society resolving, even when the land is being preserved in I think, a thoughtful way, there become these conflicting claims to the site itself that have to be negotiated. So really, we probably should wind up in a second, but one question has just come in. Marilyn asked you to identify the global commission that you mentioned that had to do with preserving sites. Tom, could you just repeat what the name of that group is?
Yeah, it's the International Astrophysical Commission on Indigenous and Heritage Sites, something like that. If you send me an email, I can send you the formal name and the contact people.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, on behalf of SAR, I just want to thank Christine, Tom, and Carla for a great presentation. Those of you who are members who want to continue the conversation at, well, it'd be 4 o'clock Mountain Time, that'd be about 45 minutes from now. Please join us for that. You can get, if you contact Amy Schiffer, she can send you the appropriate link if you're not already registered. Again, thank you both. Thank you all. And I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes to carry on the conversation.
Thank you, Mike, and Meredith, Christine, Carla, and my dog for being quiet.
Adios.
Ciao.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks. See you in a minute.